I'm Matt Booker.
And I'm Dave Laird.
And I'm David Herring. Prepare thy maps, travellers. We're heading into the Great Concavity.
Very awesome. Welcome to episode 12 of The Great Concavity, and we're joined by scholar from the UK, from Liverpool, David Herring. Dave, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. It's great to have you.
Dave, it is really great to have you. You're one of the first people we thought of when we launched this podcast that we really wanted to have on the show, so we're really excited to talk with you today. And I want to give people a little bit of an introduction to you if they are not familiar with your work.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Dave Herring is the author of a forthcoming book from Bloomsbury called David Foster Wallace, Fiction and Form. He's also the editor of a book he and I kind of collaborated on called Consider David Foster Wallace, and I think he's a lecturer at the University of Liverpool. Is that your title, Dave?
That's right, yeah.
Lecturer. Which in the US I think is more akin to like an assistant professor level. Is that correct?
From what I understand, I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah. So the title structure is a little different, but you got your degree from the University of Liverpool as well, and then just started working there. Is that correct?
No, my undergrad degree was in the University of Glasgow.
Oh, cool. Scotland.
Yeah, and then my PhD was at Liverpool, and then I got a staff job there, so I work there now.
What was your doctoral research on, Dave?
It was on structures in fiction after postmodernism. So there was which is one of the elements of it was on Wallace, but there were also other writers like Mark Danielewski was in there as well.
Oh yeah, cool.
But so the first time I ever came to Texas, to the Ransom Center, was actually to research some of the elements of Wallace's fiction for the PhD thesis actually.
Very cool.
And you've written, I know you're a fan of Mark Danielewski, and I know you've written about some other writers, but do you consider yourself first and foremost a American fictionist or a Wallace scholar, or how do you view your scholarship?
I mean, I lean very heavily towards contemporary American, or certainly kind of, post-45 American literature in a big way. I do have interest in British fiction post-45 as well, and I've written on some British writers like B.S. Johnson, but you can see also that these writers are all interested in particular things which are to do with kind of the form and structure of texts. I'm really interested in how texts kind of structure themselves and systematize themselves. I think like one of the big deals for me in terms of kind of breaking through in terms of understanding that I actually kind of wanted to do this as a career was when I first read Ulysses as an undergraduate, and I got really kind of fascinated with the idea that, when you look at all the kind of paratexts in Ulysses, and you have that stuff like, each chapter corresponds to a time and to a bodily organ and stuff like, and I was just really kind of fascinated with the idea of the way that, Joyce had kind of schematized this novel. And I think when you get to stuff like Danielewski's House of Leaves, or B.S. Johnson's The Unfortunates, or indeed a number of Wallace's works, you can see that kind of structuring going on. And I'm really, really interested in the kind of the nuts and bolts of this unusual structure that you see in contemporary fiction.
Dave, have you read The People of Paper?
No.
By Salvador Plasencia?
No, I haven't read that.
That book would probably interest you. It was originally published by McSweeney's, and then I think Harcourt did the reprinting of it. But in terms of sort of like design, layout, and the kind of space that you're talking about, it does really weird, interesting things. I think it'd be worth checking out for you, see how it sort of factors into that conversation. Yeah,
Dave, that book was recommended to me by another Wallace scholar, Mark Sheridan. I think that he did a paper on it at the first Wallace conference.
Oh, really?
And so I've heard several people mention that book. I haven't read it either, but I also don't know many people who have read B.S. Johnson, so I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I haven't.
I've never talked to anyone that I can recall about reading his stuff, and I've only read a little bit. but I really like a book that he has called "Aren't You Rather Young to Be Writing Your Memoirs?"
Oh yeah. That's a great book.
Which I think applies, universally today to almost everyone you see writing a memoir. I want to just ask them, like, aren't you rather young to be writing your memoirs?
I think the word "rather" really gets me.
Knausgaard, are you rather young to be writing your memoirs?
Oh,
a 6-volume memoir.
My struggle.
Although, by the way, those books, I'm tearing through those books. They really are fantastic.
I love them. Absolutely adore those books.
Yeah.
So
I've yet to check them out. So
I'm just kind of beginning volume 3. It took me a while to get through volume 2, but I kind of tore through the end of it, and then volume 3 is just is phenomenal as well. I mean, I really can't get enough of those books.
I agree. We could have a whole nother show just talking about those. But what I was going to ask you is, do you think Wallace made a mention of B.S. Johnson by naming the dog in Infinite Jest S. Johnson?
You know what? I hadn't even thought about that.
Whose dog is that?
It was the Incandenza's dog that got run over, right?
Oh, the one that's just like a nub by the end of, by the time Orin gets through
this.
Yeah.
Johnson.
Right.
And his mother's very sad about it.
Yeah.
I wonder who. Surely thinking it's got to be Samuel Johnson because the dictionary, because of Averil.
It was worth a shot.
There is actually. I know that Stephen Byrne wrote a piece that was on connections between The Pale King and B.S. Johnson's book called Christy Mallory's Own Double Entry, which is about kind of tax and debit and credit. So I think actually, I'm struggling to remember now. I think there might be a copy of that. In fact, no, I think there is a copy of Christy Mallory's Own Double Entry in Wallace's personal library, actually.
Wow.
I mean, it strikes me as the kind of thing he'd be interested in. Yeah.
So he did read B.S. Johnson, then I'll go as far as to say that if he had a copy of the book, I assume he looked at it.
I'm 90% certain he had a copy of that book.
That's pretty high certainty. I'll take that.
I mean, B.S. Johnson, a lot of his books in the U.S. are out of print, so they're fairly hard to come by. And when I wanted to read some, I had to pay, rather exorbitant prices for getting some of them. I wonder if we could back up a bit, though, and talk a little bit about a reading group that you have going. I don't know if it's still going in Liverpool.
It is.
They're reading Infinite Jest. Are these undergrad students or grad students? Or
they go all the way from first year undergrad to PhD, actually.
Wow.
Cool. Cool. And how many people do you have involved?
Well, it might not surprise you to know that we started with a very substantial number, and it has ever so slightly narrowed down. I mean, who would have thought? But it's now kind of settled at a pretty steady number. I think we have about a solid 12 in this group now.
That's good.
Who,
cool.
I imagine are pretty much now in it to the end. We're about halfway through the book, and they've got a bit of reading to do over Easter, and then we're going to kind of catch up after Easter. And it's been a great experience, actually. One of the reasons I wanted to make it kind of open to all levels of scholarship is because I really like the idea that there can be a group that kind of speaks across those stratifications, so that someone who's doing a PhD will be able to talk to someone who's a first year undergraduate, because we have this kind of common thing that we talk about, and you don't really have to worry about those kind of psychological stratifications that you get in the institution. And in fact, it seems to have worked really well in my experience.
That's cool.
So with this reading group, can I ask about, do you read a section and then just discuss it, or is there other assignments and sort of teaching pedagogy that goes along with the instruction around like how to read the book?
Well, actually, it's kind of outside of the curriculum. It's a voluntary thing. So basically, we kind of meet at 5 o'clock, which is kind of after classes are finished, and then we kind of have this discussion. So there's the only kind of prerequisite is that we set a number of pages. Normally, we meet every 2 weeks, and normally it's about kind of I don't know, kind of 100, 150 pages every fortnight, and then really we'll just discuss those. We usually start by discussing those pages, and then we kind of continue to discuss on kind of other stuff that is kind of springing out of that. And some of them who are in my modern American fiction class in the final year are also reading Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, which is part of that syllabus. So sometimes some of that is kind of creeping into the discussion as well. And it's just great. It's great to see, because cool. I mean, most of them just hadn't really encountered Wallace before, and you can see, you can see people really kind of picking it up. And I know there's one student who says she's kind of basically got the entire structure of Infinite Jest kind of mapped out on her wall now. It's getting steadily more elaborate with each class, which is great.
Like a forensic investigator's kind of map.
Yeah, this is what I imagine. She said there's many spider diagrams kind of spread around. Yeah. So it's great to see kind of people are really
string and thumbtacks.
Yeah. But I also, if you don't mind, I asked the group if there were any questions that they could kind of put to us in terms of the kind of discussion points about Wallace's work.
Yeah, great.
And so I have a couple here that I thought were kind of really interesting. And one was kind of specifically about Infinite Jest, and it was one of the members of the group, Scott, has asked, does Wallace make the reading experience of Infinite Jest reflect the theme of rehabilitation in the novel? So kind of the idea is that as you continue to read the novel, if you persevere, it gets easier and easier. I just wondered what your thoughts were about that.
My instinct is to say no. I think it still takes a lot of effort and attention, and you can relapse very easily and put it down even 700 pages into it. But what's your instinct, Dave?
My instinct is the opposite. That I do think that it is pretty obtuse and unforgiving, sort of in the first quarter, and I wrote about this for Infinite Winter in my sort of intro post, that there's kind of a relenting that happens where you hit a specific point, and I can give a page number for this, but I don't want to spoil anything. But there's kind of this turning point where you're like, oh, okay, and the light goes on, and you're able to kind of backtrack and then sort of put some pieces together in a way that was kind of challenging before that moment. So I think that from sort of the quarterway point on, you're starting to get pieces from Wallace that are starting to be visibly more cohesive with what you've already seen. So you're seeing Hal recurring, you're seeing Gately recurring, lots of other characters. Whereas the first 100 or 150 pages, you're just getting all this random stuff that seems really, non-cohesive and unrelated, and you're just like, how do these all fit together? So I do think that as you get further in the book, there is an ease that comes, and it starts to kind of, an engine sort of kicks in and it propels itself in a way. But I also agree with you, Matt, that I know people who've abandoned at 600, 800 pages, which to me is so sad. Like, oh, you've made it so far up the mountain, and then, But
that happens all the time in recovery, where, it's totally very rare that you get someone in recovery who sticks with it and never has a relapse and never abandons it. So I mean, when I first read the book, and this is going back a ways now, right? 19, 20 years ago. But when I first read the book, I remember loving it. And then I got to a point in 300 pages in where sort of life intervened and I had to put it down for a while. And it wasn't that it was a slog. It's still a lot to remember your first time around, to know all of these plot points and characters. And I talked to several other people who had the opposite experience, where you put it down 100 pages, but you liked it and you want to go back to it. And I think that's one thing with addiction, is that you have this mentality of this is bad for you, but yet you still can't stick with a clean program. So I do. I think there's something to that. I think it's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question.
And I think Wallace was only sort of aware of this. You know, now that I've read the book multiple times, and Dave, you can talk more about this. Dave Herring can talk a lot about sort of the structure of Infinite Jest. It didn't have the original opening for a long time. So, I mean, now that you know, like, how it was originally structured, you know, does that change your perception of how the book is sort of digested or perceived?
Right, yeah.
I suppose that there's... I mean, the thing about the book is, I think he, from my experience of what I've seen, he always had a kind of general sense of where the narrative was going. But there are certainly bits and pieces of that book that come in much later. So, yeah, like you say, that the Year of Glad opening sequence doesn't come in for quite a while. That is quite a late edition. A lot of Oren's material is late, very late, actually, in my experience. Oren's final scene in the novel is... as far as I could make it out, only appears very, very late. I mean, nearly almost kind of copy edit stage. Not quite that late, but it's a very, very late edition. And it seemed to me that Oren was a character that got kind of polished very late. He was in there, but he was never quite as immediately there as the others. And I think there's also interesting, like a number of the cuts, the larger cut areas of that book are to do with Oren. So the first scene of Oren waking up, that scene is really much longer in the original pre-cut stuff. There's a lot more of that. There's a good kind of 6 or 7 more pages of his nightmare and his kind of experiences. And then latterly there's the sequence with the Marlon Bain, Avril, Oren stuff that you get kind of later with the letter. That is a lot longer. I mean, that is kind of seriously longer. So I think there's a lot of stuff around Oren that doesn't kind of calcify until quite late. And I suppose that's a way of saying that it's weird, because I think all the assumptions that I had before I went and before I saw all those materials in the Ransom Center was that I assumed that he kind of laid everything out full, like, so kind of every detail was all there and every detail was kind of full, and then he kind of absented information. So he kind of, he would have everything, because this is the question that I think a lot of people have when they go to the archive. I'm going to look at the manuscripts of Infinite Jest, and I'm going to try and find that material that isn't in it. So the material about, what happens before the Year of Glad, and then do we get to see, Don Gately and Hal together and stuff like that. And in fact, that stuff was certainly, in terms of the material that's in there that I have seen, that material doesn't exist, and I'm not aware that material ever did exist. So he was clearly always working on it with the understanding that there was certain material that would not be there, and that the readers had to infer was there, or that there were multiple opportunities to kind of decide what was happening there. And so there are certainly late editions, like the Year of Glad, like like some of the Oren material. But a lot of the earlier material is there from very, very early. So that professional conversationalist scene, I mean, it's possible that could be there as early as the mid-'80s. Well, maybe not the mid-'80s, but the late '80s. Whether I'm right or not on that, I'm not sure. I mean, the date on that original version of the conversationalist scene says 1986. Now, I don't know whether that means the scene is taking place in 1986 in that version, or whether it was actually written in 1986. But that is a very, very early piece, and maybe the conversationalist is one of the very, very first things ever that he writes about that book.
And that was the intro for a long time, right? That was the introduction to the book,
yeah.
The first section.
Absolutely. And then there was going to be originally an immediate cut to the sequence with James Incandenza trying to being taught tennis by his father in 1960. So it was Yeah, so it was
Tucson,
going to kind of segue immediately between the two father and son conversations, and there was a much longer bit of that where the older James Incandenza's father takes him to the shed and finds Black Widows and sets Black Widows on fire. All that material is there in the Ransom Center, but I think a lot of the earlier stuff was cut on request of Michael Peach. I've seen some of the letters, and he just says, "Look, it's too much at the beginning. You're asking too much. It's already complex, and this is just too much at the beginning. I think
it's too misanthropic.
I think it's
in a way."
There's also this weird scene. I remember in a couple drafts, there's a scene right near the beginning that was cut. That is a scene of Avril Incandenza in the car with a lover on the way to an airport hotel to have an affair. Do you remember this scene?
Yeah,
Does this ring a bell?
That actually, you've just joined two previously non-joined pieces of information together in my head there, because there is this weird. Actually, that's clarified something that's been bothering me for about 5 years. So thanks, Matt. There's a handwritten piece of writing in the Ransom Center in the draft, which is about two people going to an airport, and I hadn't put two and two together and thought that was Avril, because there is a separate thing which is about her travelling with a lover in the car, and actually there's a very early draft that was written in pencil, I think, which is very unusual. Very unusual indeed. You don't get that much written in pencil in those drafts, and that is about two lovers going to the airport, and I'd not actually quite put those two things together.
Well, and when I read that first scene, it was in. I might be wrong. I'll have to check online, but I think that it's in the draft that he sent to Stephen Moore in 1994, and in that draft. What I was reminded of when I read that was that it seemed to me like he repurposed that scene later for the short story Adult World, and that in Adult World it had the same feel to me as some of the stuff that's in Adult World about people on their way to a hotel and being in a cheesy motel to have an affair. And in that section that was in an early draft of Infinite Jest, I mean, it's right up at the front, maybe the second or third section. And, we sort of think of this canonical structure that's there now where you've got it opening Year of Glad, Hal's Problem, So Yo Then Man, What's Your Story? And then it goes right into Erdity, right? Yeah. And then you've got this long Erdity thing. And then it's like, if you read all of that, you're in the book. You're committed. There's no getting out now. Although addicts will backslide. But I wonder, because you've read so many of these different versions of it, does that inform it now? Like when you go with these students who are encountering the book for the first time, do you bring that up, or do you just sort of hold back and let them experience it as it's published?
I have to be quite careful because I try to kind of cast my mind back to the first time I read it, and the kind of the level of complexity that's there is already so much that I'm kind of aware that if I'm going to start dropping in kind of pieces of information about stuff that isn't there, because so much of the time people are trying to kind of form connections between stuff that they're trying to remember from earlier in the book. So I'm trying not to kind of
complicate it too much.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying not to kind of overcomplicate it. Although, we have kind of had discussions about Wallace scholarship and what people write about Wallace, because obviously a number of them who are doing brief interviews as a syllabus book are potentially going to be writing on Wallace, and they're kind of interested to know the different ways that people have kind of approached the fiction. So we probably talk a little bit more about people who've written on Wallace and Wallace criticism and Wallace scholarship, and also I kind of share stories about talking about reading the books with other people as well. It's not so much giving them a huge amount more information, because I'm just aware that Infinite Jest is kind of more information than the brain can deal with most of the time anyway.
Any one mortal can hope to endure.
But can you tell that some of them are really, really, really into it, and this is going to be their favorite book for life, or they're just in general interested in other things?
I can definitely see that there are people who have really kind of taken to it and have really kind of taken to the kind of the journey and the adventure of it. And I think also I've never read the book in a reading group before, so the first time I read it alone, and really at that point I didn't know anyone else who read it. I didn't really have anyone to discuss it with, and I kind of remember kind of coming.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, okay, so you'll remember that experience of kind of coming out and going, I have an awful lot that I want to say, but I don't have anyone to say it to. So
some questions.
I mean, I think that's a common experience with a lot of people who read the book and then they go online to look for someone else to talk to. And, in my experience, they either end up on Twitter or Facebook groups, or they end up sometimes on our listserv. And, it hasn't happened very recently, but we used to get, half a dozen people in the course of a year who would write in and say, I have a question about Infinite Jest. I just finished it. What's going on in this part? And they're just desperate to ask someone else who's read the book.
Yeah, I mean, that was my experience. I joined the listserv because I wanted to kind of speak with people about the book, and this was kind of pre-Facebook, pre-Twitter. It's certainly pre that kind of mobilization of social media, Wallace stuff on social media, in a big way. So that was the group really, and it was it was a very active group, and it's still active. There's still a lot of people who are on it.
Yeah. So, Dave, you guys are just about at the same places as Infinite Winter in terms of being about halfway through the book. Is there any overlap that people in your reading group are checking things on Infinite Winter and bringing that to the conversation at all?
Well, there's I was speaking to it's Mark Flanagan, isn't it, who organises Infinite Winter?
Yeah.
I've emailed with Mark, and in fact he was. Kind of invited people to join. They have a Reddit group that talks about it. Yeah. So I'm sure that some of this reading group are also kind of getting involved, and I've been kind of posting links to Infinite Winter at the same time and saying this is not exactly timed with what we're doing, but you want to look at this blog, you want to look at the kind of people, kind of real time experience of people reading it together as well. So it's not a direct, it's not an exact match in terms of the read. It's a kind of pleasant overlap,
Yeah, totally. That's great.
I mean, that's another thing that whenever, the book came out 20 years ago and someone who picked it up and read it and they went online and there was not something like Infinite Summer or Infinite Winter. And in fact, there was not a published reader's guide to the book until 2001. And so, I mean, there's a lot more resources now for readers, to find each other and to talk about the book and to really even buy fan art about the book. That
coffee mugs.
Well, it sort of felt more like a cult classic back then because you're really in this small group and really no one that in real life is talking about it. So I think it's a huge step forward to have these groups of real life people that have resources they can go and learn more about the book.
Yeah, definitely, and I think it has been facilitated in a big way with social media, and I think also that certainly from an academic perspective, there's been an enormous amount of academic writing come out of the last kind of 7 or 8 years in particular.
Totally.
It really kind of is that the world weary voice of someone who has a lot more of this stuff to read?
In a way, I'm happy that's happening, but at the same time, as someone who's writing a thesis right now, it's well, I got so much stuff that I need to read, in terms of just being aware of the scholarly landscape, that it's pretty daunting.
I've had a couple of comments from undergrads or postgrads who are writing on Wallace, and a couple of times I've heard them say things like, well, I need this, I'm looking at the scholarship and there's just so much of it. And I just remember thinking, wow, because I had a finite list of everything that had been written on Wallace, and it basically all fitted on a single side of paper at one point. So the idea of the kind of massive explosion of criticism that's come in the last, particularly the last last 5 years or so, where we had, we had that, we've had a big explosion of edited collections, and now actually what we're beginning to see is that next wave of book length works, the next wave of monographs as well. So we've got Claire Hayes Brady's book, really excellent book, came out in February, and then mine's out in September. But then we also have Lucas Thompson's is coming out in I think it's December as well. Really excited about that. There's a large number of books kind of on the horizon.
And Jeff Severs, do you know Jeff Severs? Yes. He has a book coming out in, I think, October as well, from Columbia University Press. So there was a time where you could keep up with this stuff.
Yeah, totally.
And it would be a big deal to have one of these monographs published in a calendar year. Yeah. And now that, in one calendar year, we're talking 4 or 5 or 6, major works on Wallace. It's too much for one person anymore.
Yeah, it's insane for sure.
I mean, this is where it's nice to be able to say, well, it's kind of my job to read them. So I'm able to say, well, this is my job, and I have to sit and take this time and read them now. So it's a perk of the job, definitely.
Yeah, that's funny. Didn't Adam Kelly have a site that was listing all of the scholarly works on Wallace? Is he still up on that, or is that kind of now at a point where it's just too hard to keep track?
He had an article.
I think
on it.
It's Death of the Author and the Birth of a Discipline, which is 2009,
yes, right.
I think, or possibly 2010. That was in the Journal of Irish Studies.
2010. Yeah.
Right. Oh yeah, it was a paper.
And it's fascinating to see, actually, since Adam wrote that paper, the amount that has happened, basically, because that was a kind of capturing of that particular moment and what was happening in Wallace criticism at that time, and now there's been so much since. It's extraordinary. It's really, really snowballing.
Is there any other questions from your reading?
Yes, I have another question. And this is an interesting one, actually. It's a slightly broader question about Wallace's work in particular. This is from Gail, and she says, no, that's the wrong one. Hang on. She says, having just finished brief interviews, I'm wondering about whether the search for the more positive side of human nature, let alone any joy, is completely futile in Wallace's fiction. I'm very aware, because Gail has said a number of times in the group that she's reading Infinite Jest and she finds so much of it so kind of harrowing and difficult. It is. I think when you've read it a few times, you can sometimes become a bit immune to it. But particularly, the stuff with the recovery groups is really, really tough stuff. And I mean, what do you think? The positive side of human nature and joy in Wallace's fiction.
Dave, do you remember that moment at the Paris conference when one of the presenters was talking about brief interviews and saying that the characters in it were so unbelievable and otherworldly, and then someone from the audience was like, well, what do you mean? They're totally realistic, and there was kind of a tension, a tense moment. I don't want to name names, but it was a pretty extreme moment at that conference, and this kind of reminds me of that. It's does that book accurately portray human nature? And I think most people would say that it does, but you just get this collection of all of them in one place, and it's so concentrated, and there's so much abjection in one place that it feels unbelievable, maybe in a way. But yeah, I mean, Wallace definitely is no cockeyed optimist, right? He's definitely a realist about what humans are capable of, sort of in both ways. But I find so much of his writing so hilarious that he is able to capture the mirth of the human experience as well as sort of the low points. What do you think, Matt?
I think a couple of things. One, there's a line from, I've been reading Infinite Jest this time around with Infinite Winter in conjunction with
Rob.
the big book of AA.
Yeah.
And there's a line in the big book of AA where towards the end they say, if you go to enough of these meetings, you're going to hear really depressing stories every day. Every time you're going to hear someone who has ruined their life, and they have nothing going for them, and their last ditch effort is to come to this meeting. And that can be pretty depressing if you go every week or every day and you just listen to these boring stories. But there's a line in the book that says, it's a famous line that says, "We are not a glum lot." Despite all of this, we actually have something to live for. And that if we had nothing to live for, we would be miserable all the time. But we are actually pursuing happiness. Believe it or not, this is a step on the road to pursuing happiness. And AA, it's famous for rock bottom stories. You hit rock bottom, and then the only place to go is up. The only place to go is up from the bottom. So I think, there's also a famous John Updike line where he says, when has happiness ever been the subject of fiction? The pursuit of it is just that, a pursuit.
Right.
And in sort of death, he says death and its adjutants tax every transaction. In the back of your mind, there's always this thing. Even when you're having a great time, this to me very much fits Wallace. When you're having a blast, you're having a good time, you're aware that it's going to end.
You know that you're going to die one day.
You know you're going to die. You can't enjoy this forever.
This is funny. When I teach English 11, so high school English, and a few years ago, I sort of prefaced the course with some of Wallace's comments from the Larry McCaffrey interview about what fiction does, like his idea of good fiction being 49% pleasure, 51% pain. And then later and we kind of made reference to that throughout the course, and it's kind of a good touchstone for students that age to kind of refer back to as they're processing different texts. But one of the students made a comment to me after we read Cormac McCarthy's The Road, and they were like, "Okay, yeah, Mr. Laird, but like everything that we're reading is like 99% pain and 1% pleasure." And like, so what's the deal with that ratio? Like, can you give us more stuff that's like optimistic or happy? So yeah, I mean, that goes to what you're saying, Matt, that when has fiction ever just dealt with a totally gleeful side of humanity?
No, I mean, storytelling relies on some kind of a conflict to move the story along. And I mean, this idea that we should have a happy ending, or, Wallace really rejects that, I think. He never does. He has struggles with that throughout his whole career. And, Franzen sort of knocked him for this after his death. And Franzen published an essay called Farther Away. And he says, Wallace never really portrayed happy, loving couples. And there was always this
dysfunction.
Yeah, always this dysfunction, and it's like he really just couldn't love or something. And I just think that's total BS. And I think that, for a writer who's producing art, what is their goal? And is your goal to really connect with readers? If so, Wallace succeeded fantastically well.
Yeah.
So despite all appearances, I don't think that AA and the depressing parts of Wallace's fiction is truly a glum lot. I think that they are a group of characters in search of happiness. That's my take.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of redemption in Wallace's work too.
I think if you look at some of the books that Wallace recommended, you would kind of continue to recommend it, like Blood Meridian and Steps by Jerzy Kosinski, and you think, actually, these books make Wallace look like a laugh riot. Actually, these are not happy books.
Totally.
In any sense. But I also think that I think that he can be Wallace can be underrated as a comic writer as well. I think I mean the sequence, either of the major sequences with Leonard Stesic in The Pale King, the young Leonard Stesic, are really like hysterically funny writing. Like, I mean, I really do. I always find myself laughing when I read them. Very, very funny, I think.
Well, and that's sort of the way Infinite Jest was marketed too, was partly as like a comic novel. And a lot of people, early reviewers, they only really commented on the humor, of like Year of the Adult Undergarment. Wow, that's great. That's just funny.
The Statue of Liberty wearing one.
Yeah, and that was their take on the book. And it's like, wow, I'm not really sure you read the whole thing, but
yeah.
there is a lot of humor in it. You know, it is, and it's got the word jest in the title. So maybe it is funny. And I do find him funny. You know, I mean, he has this sort of juvenile sense of humor early on, especially with Boom of the System, where there's just a lot of gags and pranks and sort of Pinchonian, you know, tricks. But he clearly matures and gets a lot more interested in, you know, what I think is real adult life. And to me, that is like, the moments of joy are pretty few and far between in adult life.
You know, like as a parent, you know.
I mean, just as a working adult, day in and day out, I mean, it's really a struggle to stay positive.
Right.
I mean, where do you think that question sort of originates, Dave? Is that more just about like someone searching for answers in the book, or being sort of turned off by the negativity of it?
Where do I think that that original question comes from?
Yeah,
I think it's I think it was just kind of in response to the particularly like kind of maybe kind of reading Infinite Jest in tandem with brief interviews, and I think particularly at the stage we're at in the group with Infinite Jest, it is still quite a kind of catalogue of horrors, you know, and I think that kind of earlier moment of those of the recovery groups, and also of you know, the kind of general bad stuff like poor Tony having a seizure and stuff. I mean, these are really kind of palpably shocking and kind of unpleasant sequences. And then also the business in Copley Square with C getting dosed with Drano and his eyeball popping out of his head. You know, it's kind of easy to forget. And in fact, kind of going over it, kind of reading it again, I had forgotten just what a gruesome book it is, actually.
Yeah, it is ghastly.
I wonder how much of that reflects where Wallace was mentally when he was writing, and really what he was trying to achieve artistically in terms of the book being about, you know, sort of a unique American sadness of the times. And, I think to me that wasn't something, maybe I was more in sync with that emotionally at the time, but like it just doesn't feel to me like completely as off-putting, like you said, because I had read some other things that were even more bleak and horrific.
Right. Yeah, Dave, I wonder what your take is as like a North American continental about the stuff about American life. Wallace talks a lot about, like, this book is very American, and like a lot of his interview stuff is about that particularly. So for someone who's in the UK, what do you make of that? How do you respond or relate to it as you read? Is it something that resonates with you culturally?
I mean, I think that there are things in there that, I mean, I think, okay, so if these novels were kind of so US centric in terms of their points of reference that that they were kind of not incomprehensible, but, you know, kind of not really translatable, then I don't think I could have made that connection with those novels in the first place. So I think there's I mean, I think potentially there's an element to that kind of amplification of late 20th century capitalism that you get in that slightly kind of futuristic narrative in Infinite Jest, which speaks to, you know, any what Wallace called Western industrial society, you know, Western industrial country that is experiencing, you know, late capitalism, that is experiencing that kind of cyclical, that endlessly kind of generating kind of capitalism. And I think there are the effect that is going to be had on the psyche of any individual in those countries. I mean, I think in America it has accelerated faster than it has done, say, in the UK. But that's not to say that, you know, that the UK is in any sense kind of immune from that kind of sadness or that kind of. I think sometimes, you know, the UK might like to think that kind of culturally that it isn't, but I think it's, you know, it's still very much kind of embedded within that, within a lot of those same reference points. And while I think in Wallace's work he is a lot of the time very specifically talking about America. This is another reason I'm interested in Lucas's book, is because, you know, he's trying to frame Wallace against world literature, from what I understand, and I think it's interesting because I do think about Wallace as a primarily American author. For all the kind of universality of his of the sentiment and the emotion, I do think of him as being very, very particularly caught up with American matters. There's nothing. I mean, it's going to be one of those sweeping statements that I'm immediately proved wrong on here. But there's nothing. He never set anything outside America, right? Is that right? Apart from Canada.
Nothing comes to mind immediately.
The Canadian stuff, apart from the Canadian stuff in Infinite Jest.
Well, what about the story Another Pioneer?
Oh yeah.
That's sort of like it's a myth in a way, or a folk tale, but it's unique because it's overheard. It's got a framing structure where it's overheard on a plane on the way to South America, I think. But that's just, you know, like you say, if you put out a bold statement like that, someone's going to try to find an exception to the rule. But I think for the most part, you're right. Let's say 99% of his work is really set in. I think a lot of it is just really set in the Midwest. So much of it is set in the Midwest, but, you know, dealing with Boston and Amherst and Arizona and Illinois, I mean, that's got to be like 80% of his work is in those places. Yeah. I mean, the cruise ship is right, and maybe international waters. It's
we're clutching at straws here, aren't we?
But I think that's an interesting point, because I wonder a lot about why his work has done so well in, say, Italy. Italy. Mm-hmm. And Italy sort of has a similar situation with its government that is often falling apart or is often non-functional, and the economy is just up and down, and you get this sort of, I don't know, sadness or this existential angst towards, well, you know, what are we sort of doing here? What are we living like? What are we living for? What are we, you know, how should a person live?
And your head of state in Italy, well, was a TV mogul as well. I mean, he's kind of beyond anything that Wallace could cook up, almost, you know.
No, he was a Donald Trump character. I mean, he was a Donald Trump character, and I think Wallace saw that as a uniquely American thing, but I think it translated very well to Western Europe, and, you know, is now in places like Brazil that also have, you know, strange large economies and faltering governments and things like that. So it's interesting to see how that book in particular translates, but it seems to do, you know, phenomenally well at a sentence level. In translation, as opposed to being at, you know, largely thematic. Like, you're not going to get the themes if you don't just plow through paragraph after paragraph of the writing. And I think that's, you know, the unique blend that sort of Wallace was able to achieve, and every writer sort of wants to achieve. You know, connect to people on a very personal level, but then also make this like larger social statement, or, you know, have some importance at that level. So, I mean, that's a great question. Going back to the original question, which was sort of about positivity and negativity and this sort of almost stereotypical characters that are in brief interviews. But, you know, for me, I think there's a good balance, actually, between sort of pursuit of happiness and actually achieving it. Because achieving it is, to me, somewhat hollow. Like, I'm always aware.
Always fleeting.
It's always fleeting, and I'm always aware that, you know, it's going to end. And Wallace being super self-conscious, I'm sure that played a part in his as well. But you know, if you have another question, I want to hit that, and then I have another question for you about your book before we go.
Those are the questions I have. So we can move along.
Awesome. Thanks to your reading group for those. Those are fantastic.
And we want to give a shout out to your reading group and say thanks for following along, and feel free to email us or hit us on Twitter with any other conversation. We'd love to just talk to, you know, especially people who are reading the book for the first time.
Yeah, totally. Definitely. One of my really sort of like distinct memories of Infinite Jest is that the book that I read after Infinite Jest felt really lackluster. And it was a pretty good book. Like, it was Naked by David Sedaris. And, you know, it has lots of critical acclaim. It's funny. But I remember just reading that book right after and being like, this just, in comparison to Infinite Jest, is, you know, if I read it any other time, I'm sure I would just be loving it. But compared to the experience I just had, I don't know. It just falls a bit flat. Do you guys remember what book you read after Infinite Jest and how you felt about it?
Oh, Jesus. I mean, you're going back. For me, I read the book in like 19...
So this is like 10 years ago for me.
This is like 20 years for me.
Right, yeah.
I don't recall. I mean, I think I probably read another Wallace book.
Yeah. I think I like hopped on that train really fast after too.
I think the book, but believe it or not, I think the book that I read after Infinite Jest was The Recognitions. Which... Wow. Not content with punishing myself with 1,100 pages, I decided to read The Recognitions after. Although I was on a kind of a long stretch of not having to. I didn't have to work, so I was basically working through all of these massive books that I'd been meaning to read for a very long time. So, I mean, I wouldn't recommend reading The Recognitions immediately after Infinite Jest in any circumstance.
Give yourself a light break.
Yeah, I mean, Infinite Jest was like, reading a newspaper compared to reading The Recognitions. So, but it's and I lack the stamina nowadays to kind of light 1,000-page book off the next like a chain smoker.
Yeah. Speaking of 1,000-page books, Dave, have you read The Instructions by Adam Levine?
No, it sits on my shelf glowering at me, and one day I will read it.
Oh man, it's so good! It's so good. I recommend it so highly.
No, I have
I've met like one or two other people who have read it, and it's been fun conversation.
A friend of mine, Liz, just said she's going to start reading that book, and I haven't read it yet either. And I was like, I know a couple of other people who've read it, and I was like, I really got to get to it, but I also have like 30 books on my nightstand that I need to finish.
Totally. It's way easier than Infinite Jest. Like, it doesn't have the same kind of density, but it's very immersive and hilarious as well.
And I'm also working through the new Mark Danielewski 27-volume novel called The Familiar. So that's kind of interspersing that and Knausgaard is kind of now basically the equivalent of a full-time job. So I'm in this now for who knows how long, until they both finish, basically.
Mm-hmm. So I'm waiting on the new Knausgaard to be published in the US, Volume 5 in April, and I have a tradition sort of the past couple years, or a year and a half, 2 years, I've been reading it every Saturday and Sunday morning. And now that I don't have those books, I'm waiting on the next one. I'm really desperate to get a hold of. Like, I sort of don't feel like I'm having any fun in the weekends now because of that. But I don't have.
You're like those Game of Thrones readers who are waiting for like the 7th book to come out, and they're just like tweaking, And now the show's like surpassing the books, and people are freaking out.
And I'll be really sad when that project is done. But my question for you about the book. So I sort of knew you were working on this book for a while, and when it was announced by Bloomsbury, they posted a table of contents, and there was only 4 chapters to the book, and I was like, wow, this must be like really substantive, like long, detailed chapters. And one of them, I want to kind of ask you a little bit about each of them, because it seems like one of them is about ghosts, and one of them is about regionalism, or what I think is like the Midwest. Maybe I'm wrong about that. You set me straight. Another one is about mirrors, which I heard you talk about a little bit last year, I think, with Las Meninas. Yeah. And then the last one is about the Pale King, which sort of interests me most, about the construction of the Pale King. So is that right? And if 2, how are they sort of spread across the book or tied together?
Yeah, no, I mean that is basically right. Yeah, I mean the thing that underpins the book really is that there were a number of motivations. One, I think that I wanted there to be a kind of a comprehensive analysis of the structures of his writing across his fiction, across all of his fiction, and I like the idea of a kind of dual analysis which took into account the published fiction and also the processes of writing the fiction as reflected in his papers in the archive. So there's this kind of dialogue between what he's writing in his papers in the archive and then the actual published the published stories themselves, the published fiction itself, which obviously that relationship complicates massively when The Pale King comes out, because it's an assembly that was put together extremely masterfully by Michael Peach. I mean, looking at those papers, I just, it's almost impossible to believe that Peach got something so clear out of them. But in terms of thinking about the chapters themselves, I mean, so this idea of a dialogue is really what underpins the entire book. Is that I really read Wallace's fiction so much as a kind of conflict between the monologue and the dialogue, and the monologic and the dialogic. I see Wallace's fiction as wanting to be dialogic, wanting to be in conversation, wanting to be about conversation, wanting to be a conversation. But that is always, he is always hyper aware of the problem of the monologue, and that itself is very, very tied up in the extent to which he is present or not present in his books. And anyone who's read his books will know that he has this kind of slightly vexed relationship. It's kind of this kind of slight kind of hide and seek relationship with his own presence in his books, and he's also responding very strongly to this idea of authorial effacement, of post-structuralism, of the death of the author, which is a strong element of his education in the 1980s. This is like real theory, high watermark of theory. Yeah, absolutely. In American academies in the 1980s, and so what I wanted to do was to read, and this is what I do in the books. I read that conflict between the monologic and the dialogic at the level of the subject of his text and the construction of his fiction, but also at the level of composition. So these things kind of weave into one another. And so the chapter about ghosts, ghostliness, which is the first chapter, and which I think I'm now so interested in ghostliness in literature, I'm probably going to go on and write something about that next, I think. But because it's just, once you open that box, there's so much going on there. But
this is your conference paper in Paris, right?
Yes,
based on that,
the conference paper in Paris was a kind of early version of a little bit of that chapter, and basically, I'm talking in that chapter a lot about the idea of possession, of voices being possessed by other people, of your voice being possessed by someone else's voice, and then that sudden kind of increase in ghostly figures or ghosts in the fiction, which seemed to me to be performing a kind of a dramatization of that fear about who is speaking and who is speaking for that person. And in fact, when you go through the fiction, you just get, the prevalence of ghosts just gets stronger and stronger and stronger. It kind of moves from being about, not being able to find your own voice to being actually literally possessed by a ghost, or to have a kind of literally have a conversation with a ghost in the text itself. And so that's the first chapter. So I'm kind of talking about that there. The second chapter about kind of regionalism and about Midwesternism, and also about the idea of the institution as well is.
Can I pause you there for a second and just ask you, Ghosts,
sure,
did you draw on Timothy Jacobs' work at all? He did about ghosts.
Oh yeah. Timothy Jacobs' work gets cited in a big way in that chapter, and actually, I really think that that was never published. That piece about ghosts, because this is part of his thesis.
It's just a dissertation, I think.
The brothers in Candenza.
Yeah. So that piece on the brothers Karamazov and Infinite Jest got published. That's a really good article. There's another part of that thesis which is online, which can be found. You can find that. It's called The Eschatological Imagination.
Oh, I have it. Oh no, I have it. Yeah.
That guy actually taught in Kelowna, and I emailed him like years ago and was like, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing a master's on Wallace. Any programs in Canada that you'd recommend?" And so we had a bit of a back and forth. That was cool.
Well, I saw him at the
New York. He was at the New York conference, right? Yeah.
He was. That's where I met him. Yeah.
No, he's a friend. I would say he's a friend of mine. So, I mean, but he was one of the first, I think, who I had read, who took the idea. I think it's really interesting about narration. I was going to ask if you dealt with sort of issues of narration and ghosts at all there, or is it more like representational?
No, I think that the idea of narration is always absolutely tied up with the idea of ghosts in Wallace. Because I mean, if you look at a story like Good Old Neon, which is, I mean, you know, I found myself kind of, you know, trying to kind of forensically pull apart the layers of narration in that story when I was discussing it, because obviously that gets discussed in a big way in the ghost chapter because it's about a ghost, and you know, it's almost, I mean, it is basically almost impossible to thoroughly pull apart the layers of narration in that story. They are so kind of interwoven, and it's so hard to ever tell always who is being spoken to, or where that conversation is taking place, or whether it's taking place in, you know, a number of places simultaneously. And I think that is one of the huge strengths of that story, which I mean, I think, you know, one of the advantages of reading and rereading Wallace is that you eventually, you know, certain pieces really present themselves as being absolutely, you know, amazing, you know, his very best pieces. And I think Good Old Neon is one of them. Like, I don't know if he ever, you know, I don't know if that level of writing that he's doing in Good Old Neon is, you know, as good as it gets for me from Wallace.
I agree.
And so I think that the ghosts and the narrative thing, yeah, they're absolutely connected. And I do cite Timothy Jacobs quite a bit in that chapter, because I just think the work he did on ghosts in Wallace is really fantastic, actually, and well worth everyone's time. Yeah.
Cool.
So the chapter on regionalism, I assume, is a lot about the Pale King. Is that, or is there more to it?
Well, basically, the chapter on regionalism is to do with Wallace's sense of himself as a program writer, as a kind of institutional writer, and how much this is connected to the fact that his fiction comes, much of it, as you said earlier, in fact, comes from the Midwest. And actually, the way that the book is structured, I don't actually deal with the Pale King at all until the final chapter, in which I talk about the kind of the construction of that book, and then I kind of address all the elements of the previous three chapters specifically to the Pale King. So that's the kind of big conclusion. So I come back to kind of talking about the Pale King and the Midwest there. And in fact, one of the readings that I do of the Pale King as a Midwestern novel in that last chapter is that I talk quite a bit about the idea of it as being really interested in the way that kind of capital works in the Midwest, in the way that capital kind of sucks out the center of kind of regional towns and small cities, and kind of creates these kind of weird kind of circular shapes, because he's really interested. Wallace is always interested in circles and cycles and these kind of circular shapes. So he's really interested, I think, much more politically in the Midwest in that final, in his final novel, in The Pale King. I think he often tends to be a bit more performative about the Midwest. He often tends to see it as a bit more of a trope or a kind of motif or something to play with in a quite kind of in quite a kind of playful way, in something like Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way. But I think he's much more kind of heartfelt about the actual, you know, the economy of the Midwest and the character of the Midwest in as it relates to kind of human beings in The Pale King.
Oh, that sounds wonderful, and I'm definitely gonna read that. But what I really am curious about is that section about the Pale King, where you get into the details of what sort of is the Pale King and how did Wallace imagine it. And for me, when I was in the Ransom Center and saw this document that Michael Peach had sort of indexed everything he took out of Wallace's house, that sort of was an eye-opener to me of how Wallace maybe did have this sort of oeuvre of like dialogic works that were in conversation with each other, and some of it just happened to end up in The Pale King, some of it happened to end up in Oblivion or even brief interviews. So do you get into that level of detail of like biography of like how did he, the timeline that he was writing things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not kind of. I wouldn't necessarily say it was biographical, but I would say it's historical, definitely. So basically, for the first part of that final chapter, I take the entire 10-year period, 97 to 2007, which is the period during which he was basically writing The Pale King in one way or another, and basically I kind of almost like forensically lay out what he was doing in those periods of time, and as a way of doing it, I kind of split his compositional periods into three, because I think there are three distinct compositional periods there. The first is when the novel was called Sir John Feelgood and it was about pornography, and then that's kind of bracketed by the release of Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, in which much of that the ideas of pornography and sex kind of disappear into that collection. And then secondly, there's a period up until about 2005 where the novel is called Glitterer, and there's an enormous amount of material. And there's just so much material on that novel that is not out there, you know. So there's all the stuff from Sir John Feelgood, and there's a lot of stuff from Glitterer that is that is in there, which is available in the archive. But you can also absolutely see why Michael Peach did not just throw everything in the kitchen sink at The Pale King, because the thing is that a lot of this extra material is not additional to what is in The Pale King, but it's kind of an alternative version of it. So the novel has so many kind of different openings. So in my book, that you'll get to see the opening to Sir John Feelgood, but you'll also get to see the opening to Glitterer, both of which are completely different to the opening to The Pale King. So these it's a kind of difficult. It's kind of difficult to piece these things together, because so often they're actually kind of the same thing. They're actually the same. They're actually doing the same thing, so they can't all be kind of represented in the same book. But then I think the thing that was one of the things that was most fascinating to find is that once Oblivion is published, and I think, you know, if you've read The Pale King, you've read Oblivion, you can kind of understand that a lot of the material for The Pale King went into Oblivion, right? So The Soul Is Not a Smithy is part of The Pale King. There's an early version of that story that has Drinian in the classroom. There's an early version that has Nugent in the classroom. Then there's a later version that has kind of different characters from The Pale King in it. Incarnations of Burned Children is Drinian's childhood story originally, and then that ends up in and then Mr. Squishy is also part of The Pale King originally. It takes place in a slightly kind of tangential world to it.
I didn't mean for you to spoil the whole book, Dave. You can save some revelations for the book.
But yeah, there is much in there. I mean, really, I am honestly only kind of breaking the surface of what I discovered. You know, there is so much there. I lay it out in some detail, basically, so we get to see how all those kind of extra areas kind of develop. There is a lot going on in there.
That's cool. What's the final page count, Dave?
I don't know actually, because I've not had the proofs yet. It's probably going to be around just over 200 pages, I think, something like that.
Nice. That's great. In September is the approximate release date?
Beginning of September it should be.
Cool.
So yeah, it's one of those things you've had your head in it for so long that it's I'm just really now looking forward to getting it out there, and you know, hopefully people are going to be able to take stuff from it and really kind of dig into it. That's all you can really hope for with a critical book, is that other people are going to read it and respond to it. So yeah, that's my hope for it anyway.
Well, I can't wait to read it, and I've been looking forward to it for a long time, and I really want to thank you for coming on the show today, talking with us.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
I'm still thinking about the pizza you and I had together last year in Chicago. We had some incredible pizza, and I was like, man, this is truly like an epic pizza level. I was like, when you're in Chicago, go get some deep dish, you know.
I was talking about that pizza yesterday. You know, it's left a serious mark on me, that pizza. I mean, it was quite simply the biggest pizza that I've ever seen, and the deepest pizza that I've ever seen, and something like that. You know, that's a marker. That's a pit on the mountainside. That, you know.
It was really a great experience. So it's fun to talk with you again here today, and first day of April 2016. I'm sad I'm going to miss the conference this year. They moved it to the middle of summer, and I'm not going to be able to make it. So.
Dave, are you planning to go this year?
No, I can't. I mean, it's a question of money as well. I'm just not going to be able to. Various things are happening, but I'm not going to be able to make it this year. Maybe next year.
Yeah, cool. Well, we'll look forward to that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that brings us to approximately the end, I think. Dave, where can people find you online? Where can they check out what's going on with your stuff on social media or academic stuff? Where can they find you?
I'm on Twitter, and I think if you just type in David Herring Liverpool on Twitter, then you'll find me.
And there you are. Lots of discussion about Twin Peaks coming out of your social media accounts, which is great.
Oh yeah. Oh, there's going to be even more in another year's time, right?
Yeah.
If it ever happens, I think I've said I'll believe it when I'm sat down watching it. You know.
Yeah, totally right. That's great. Well, thanks again, Dave.
Pleasure.
And Matt, where can people find The Great Concavity online?
We're at Concavity Show on Twitter and on Instagram, and you can email us at concavityshow@gmail.com. I still have some of those bookmarks from the Pale King in case anyone wants some. I gave away a bunch and mailed a bunch out all over the planet. There's still got more left, so hit me up at concavityshow@gmail.com if you want a bookmark.
Excellent.
Right on.
Cool.
Until next time.
Till next time.
Don't beseech me for the answers you seek. Oh, I kept explaining that I was too tired to continue to speak.
Are either one of you sitting near a garbage truck?
No,
I'm not, but I'm hearing that too.
Really?
Yeah.
Dave, are you near like an open window or something?
No. I'm wondering.
Okay,
Just hang on.
curious.
No, I've got like no noise at all.
Okay.
Huh.